testosterone. People put testosterone patches, 10 milligram a day, to increase the androgen, and there was no difference. It was completely useless. Then they tried microdose, flare, and it doesn't seem to make any huge difference. In some cases, a microdose agonist protocol may have worked. People tried putting LH, and they said, oh, let's put a bit of LH. LH is better. Several studies failed to show a positive impact. Then they said, let's increase the dose, let's give more FSH, let's push the ovary harder. Again, that did not work. Then suddenly, men are men. Men think that women are equal. So if Viagra works for men, it should work for women also. So we tried giving Viagra, and that did. A recent study shows a complete waste of time. Then we tried clomiphene, and clomiphene also, from day 2 to day 6, did not seem to work. So there was insufficient evidence to suggest that any of these treatments work for poor responders. When somebody came up and said, let's use growth hormone, it's like phases. Somebody says, oh, I use growth hormone. All these studies are done in 1994 to 1996, and that is a small amount of data on which we are talking. Simple question is, you put back more embryos, your pregnancy rates are better. That's the bottom line. If you get only one embryo, your pregnancy rates are going to be low in a poor responder. You get more embryos and you put back more embryos, pregnancy rates are high. Then the French, remember there are two types of people you have to be worried about. The Americans, who will always inflate things, and the French, who will confuse you to no end. The French said, let's start natural IVF. It's no ovarian stimulation, very low or no gonadotropin, it's cheap. But I tell patients, they say, can you do natural IVF? I say, you have a choice. You can go home and do natural IVF yourself, and that's called sex. You don't have to pay me for that. Or you can ask me to do natural IVF and pay me for what you could do at home. So that choice is yours. If somebody wants to pay me for that, no problem. There's no risk of ovarian hyperstimulation. It is patient friendly, and it's a valid alternative. 20 studies were done. Embryo transfer could be done only in 45% of cases, and there was a high cancellation rate. Premature LH surge and ovulation occurred, so people thought, oh, let's do a modified natural. Then there was a study done, this was done in Guy's Hospital, they looked at in 20 years, what has natural IVF done? And if you look at the success rates, it is absolutely poor. So when people say natural IVF works, I tend to tell them, show me the evidence. People always say, our results are fantastic. It is like saying, I sell the best cars, I sell the best computers, I sell the best cameras. Evidence is often lacking. Poor responders' oocyte quality is beyond repair, and that is very important to tell your patients, that you can do whatever you want, you cannot change oocyte quality. There is no effective treatment for poor responder. Poor responder means a lower reserve. 20 different trials have been done. The ovarian reserve reduced with age, and response tends to change. There is one possible treatment for poor responders, and that is to lower the female age. That is the most efficient treatment of poor responders. If you can make a woman younger, if any of you all knows how to make ovaries, I'm sorry, women don't grow old. I stand corrected. Ovaries grow old. And if anybody knows to make the ovaries younger, please, I'm willing to sign an agreement with you and we'll start marketing it. But that's the only choice. Then the question is, do you use a long protocol? Let's say you decide your patient doesn't want egg donation, and it is one place where I want you to have a rethink of the long protocol. Pituitary suppression always lowers antral follicle count. Whatever you try, give it the pill, any pituitary suppression will lower antral follicle count, and antral follicle counts drop. That's one protocol where we think that a long protocol may not work. It is better to go and work with nature in those cases. Now, years ago, it was again, we started a new system. We said, well, what if we start stimulating anytime? And people said, oh, it doesn't happen. But we did that for our cancer patients. We started stimulating whenever we saw good number of antral follicles. And that's what I call chasing the antral follicle. Now, what we know is that follicle recruitment is a constant process. Remember, I showed you a slide with corpus luteum, and you could see small antral follicles there. We know that follicles are recruited at any time. It is not a follicular phase phenomenon. Peak of antral follicle varies, and we know that in women with a poor reserve, follicle count will vary from cycle to cycle and from phase to phase. In poor responders, the pool of antral follicle may vary. Now, I'm not talking of normal responders, I'm not talking of PCO. Those patients do well with traditional protocols, long protocol or antagonist protocol. I'm talking of poor responders who may have no choice but to say you need egg donation. It is knowing when to stimulate that counts. So, this is my geometric diagram, and by that now you must have realized I'm bad at maths and algebra and geometry also. What it tells us, in follicular phase, you see a certain number of follicles on a scan. In the luteal phase, you see a corpus luteum and you see a certain number of antral follicles. What you have to decide is in which stimulation path or which part of the cycle is the antral follicle count good. It may vary. If it remains constant, it doesn't matter, but in some cases, it will vary. Now, there are two types of poor responders. The young poor responder, who is a young woman who has a low AMH, who produces only 1 egg or 2 eggs, and an older poor responder. You can't do much with an older poor responder. Age is still a very major factor. You can get more eggs, there's no doubt. I've got sometimes 8 or 10 eggs from a single cycle, but you cannot change the outcome. So if somebody is young, somebody is less than 40 years old, in our setup we say less than 40, and it was, I call it chasing the antral follicle. And then what happened is, I presented this somewhere, and this is the response I got from this man. And that's Professor Homburg. He was shocked. He thought that I was talking nonsense. So we said, let's look at what happens. What is different in a young poor responder? Follicle recruitment varies. It is important to realize that follicle recruitment is a constant process, and fixed protocols do not work in a poor responder. Again, I'll come and say is working with nature. Whenever your IVF cycle works with nature, you do better, and antral follicles are changing all the time. It's finding out when to intervene. So who is a young poor responder who is less than 37, who has a variable antral follicle count, await the good antral follicle? An older responder, results are much worse. Whatever you try, even if you get eggs, results seem to be a lot worse. So when do you scan? You can do a couple of things. You can either scan on day 27, 28, just before the start of the period, and have a look at the antral follicles. Or you can scan on day 1 or day 2. That's the only time when I think it's valid scanning them to see if the follicles are changing. Or you can scan mid-cycle. And all tend to give you an idea of how to stimulate. So let's go here. This is again my diagram. What it tells you is, now I've seen this woman on day 26. She's got only 3 follicles. I see her on day 2 to day 3, and she's got a dominant follicle and 2 or 3 more follicles. So what I say is, I'm not going to stimulate this ovary now. I see day 11, then she's got a dominant follicle, and I see more antral follicles going. This is where you start seeing a variable antral follicle count. Few more follicles appear. Now what would you do in normal? You would say, hang on, come back during your period. What we do here is we say, yes, I've seen good antral follicles, let me start stimulating now. So but what do you do when you start stimulating? You give cetrotide to knock off this big follicle for 2 days or 3 days, and you start stimulating the ovaries with the cycle. So what you've done is you stimulated day 12, day 13. Does it happen in normal stimulation? No. How many people do it? Very few do it, but it works. I see about 30% of our patients have been told that they need to go for egg donation. 30% of them have babies. Not huge, but still, 1/3 of the women I treat with AMH less than 3 who have been told that they need egg donation go ahead to have their own babies. The other 2,000, I would say, 2/3, I would say that's what you need to do. But what it is telling us to do is trying to tell us when to stimulate. If you see a corpus luteum, but you see a good antral follicle count, you can start stimulating in the luteal phase. But remember one thing, once you stimulate at a different time, you cannot replace embryos in a fresh cycle. Your endometrium is out of sync. You cannot change that. If you want to do a fresh cycle, you have to stimulate in the follicular phase. Any other stimulation, you have to freeze the embryos. There is no choice. But if you change, if you decide, no, I need to change the system slightly, I need to stimulate when the ovary presents with its best antral follicle count. And that could happen anywhere, anytime. Happen day 1, day 2, day 10, day 11, day 14. That job is yours. You have to scan them so frequently. And there are cases when you see a corpus luteum and you see a fantastic antral follicle count, then you intervene. High protocols don't work. So if you decide you want to give a huge dose of gonadotropins, I'll tell you, an example. If you ask me to run a marathon, how many of you all think I'll succeed? No one. Gosh, what confidence. That's exactly what you do it because my reserve is poor. What is the use asking me to work harder? I can't. I may probably be able to run 100 meters. The same thing happens with women with low reserve ovaries. Pushing them very hard just does not work. You see one follicle growing, give a dose of 450 and one follicle grows. High doses don't create more follicles and also you cannot stimulate what you can see. So what do? I always scan luminal luteal phase. I always think it's better to scan the luteal phase. It does a couple of things. See, you have to think of it from a medical point of view, it is good. You don't have to rush in. And a patient calls up and says, "Doctor, I've started my period." So what do? You pick up your pajamas, change your clothes and rush to scan her. Madness. Scan them before. Next, also, when you scan in the luteal phase, you can give them a plan. We have a lot of consent forms and you can charge them before you start treatment. Once they start their treatment in the follicular phase, if you give them drugs, they may say, "I'm not going to pay you after day 7. So this is a better way of charging them. Always scan in luteal phase. Financially, it's much better. So you measure the follicles and you divide them into the big follicles and the small follicles. I always draw. And what protocol do we use? I use Clomid. And why do I use Clomid? Let's go back to the first lecture I gave. Clomid gives a rise of FSH, but it gives a sustained rise of FSH. The FSH level keeps on going high. And I give Clomid from day 1 to day 9 or day 10. What does it do? It gives a mild rise of FSH continuously. It keeps on increasing FSH and it is sustained. Also, the most important thing is Clomid blocks the LH surge. So you can give the antagonist later. You don't have to introduce the antagonist early if you use clomiphene. And then I give 150 of FSH. Here you can use FSH. There is no need to use HMG. Why? Because FSH is more potent. That's the only place where you can generate more oocytes. So you can use Fostimon, you can use Gonalef, you can use Pyrogon. And that's where it may be used. I'm not saying it will be. But why? I give it in the morning. Why? Remember one thing, that you have to keep women occupied. It's very important. And my wife says she wants to take a year off work, that gives you more stress. Whenever you keep women occupied, they are very happy. So same way, when you give medications, I give Clomid at night and I give FSH in the morning. So women think they're doing something different. My other doctor didn't say that. I said, no, I know things better. And it's a way of building up that confidence in patients, of saying, we do something better because we understand these ovaries better. And then if you want to add something, if you want to see a discrepancy, then you can add HMG, but always do it at a different time. So, what I tend to do is, I give Clomid at 10 o'clock, I give FSH at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if I add HMG, I do it at 8 in the evening. Look at it, it looks as if the woman is busy. She's busy doing something which she never did in a previous unit. Then you can start cetrotide day 10. The earlier you start cetrotide, you knock off small follicles. But because you're giving Clomid, you can start giving cetrotide. and then you have a look at new follicles. Now, this is see this diagram. So what you do is you start stimulating, you give clomate and you give FSH. Now here you have 3 follicles growing, and you see some follicles lagging behind. If some follicles are lagging behind, you can add a small amount of FSH or HMG in the evening, a very small amount, just to aid those small follicles to grow. Again, can you stimulate in the luteal phase? Yes. Again, it depends on when the anterior follicle count is good. And we know from evidence, I would like to believe that whatever I say is correct. And every time we go back to evidence, we realize that, hang on, there is evidence that suggests that luteal stimulation works. So if you look at this, there's comparison between follicular phase stimulation and luteal phase stimulation with clomiphene and HMG. So whenever I think, gosh, I'm such a brilliant man, I've come up with a new invention, I have a look at the papers and somebody else has come up with it. And I keep thinking I'll get a Nobel Prize. But if you see here, the luteal phase stimulation produced more follicles than a follicular phase stimulation. The live birth rate between a follicular phase stimulation, a mixed stimulation, or a luteal phase stimulation were much better than a follicular phase stimulation. A mixed stimulation is stimulating anytime you want. Day 11, day 12, day 10. And there is evidence that suggests, and where do we see this evidence? We see evidence from young cancer patients. Cancer patients come to you, you can't tell them, oh, no, come back on day 1 of your period. By which time the cancer specialist would have done a surgery. We stimulate as soon as the patient comes. And that's in young patients, we know it works very well. But what we know in poor responders, if you wait for the anterior follicle, use clomiphene, and use a small dose of HMG or FSH, it is possible that luteal phase stimulation will give you. Have a look at the cancellation rate. Luteal phase had a lower cancellation rate. Follicular phase had a higher cancellation rate. All our treatments are geared towards follicular phase stimulation. So I want you, next time when you say to a patient that nothing is going to work, start looking at luteal phase stimulation. Start looking at random starts. And there's evidence that it works. They give clomiphene for 5 days and they use HMG 75 to 150. You don't need to push the ovaries hard. Now, comparison between starting ovarian stimulation day 2 versus day 15 of menstrual cycle. This is not on poor responders. This is generally on oocyte donors. Now, if you say, what happens if a woman walks in on day 15? And then we say, let's start stimulating the ovaries. She'll say, oh, nobody tried that. And if you see here, number of cloud-preservation blastocysts with the same number of pregnancy rate was the same. It doesn't matter. You do a luteal phase stimulation for young patients or you do a follicular phase stimulation. As long as you freeze the embryos, it does not matter wherever. So if you decide, as Amit was just saying outside, that you can start anytime, and that is what evidence is coming up. That remove those concepts in your head, mainly in poor responders, that you have to wait for day 1. That you can stimulate whenever you wish. Now the question comes up is, can you do a dual stimulation? It's very rare. I've done it only 5 or 6